Well, good to see everybody again. We are now in chapter 26, which means we're going to be dealing with the Second World War. And of course, this is an enormous subject. Like so many of the topics that we have covered in this semester, you could give over an entire year, an entire course to dealing with this subject matter and not really do it the justice that it deserves. Obviously, we don't have anything like that kind of time as we draw near the end of the semester, so we're going to be painting some very broad brushstrokes. We're going to work at trying to give you an understanding of where World War II comes from, and how the United States reacts to it, how the U.S. finally gets involved in it, and then look at the contribution of the United States to Allied victory in the war. And what that means is I'm going to break this lecture up into two parts. The first part is, where does the war come from? How does the U.S. react to it? How does the U.S. get involved in it? And then the second lecture, which will probably be a bit shorter, is going to look at the U.S. contribution to the war, both, of course, in Europe and the Pacific, as well as theaters like the Mediterranean. We're not going to talk about specific battles and tactics and things like that. We're going to paint the big, broad brushstrokes of American strategy, debates between the United States and the other allies about what that strategy should be, the contribution of American industry to the war, the social changes that the war works upon the United States and the American people. So this is going to be a part A. Part B, there'll be 5 questions that come with each part, so we're going to spend some time in chapter 26, but chapter 26 deserves to have a little bit of extra time spent on it, because basically, everything that comes afterwards is going to be vastly influenced by World War II. But remember, we can draw a line all the way back to World War I. World War I is of course vital to understanding why there is a World War II. So we'll go ahead and begin here with a reminder of just what World War I had done, not only in the massive amount of casualties that it inflicted upon all of the combatants, but the disruption to world order. Empires had collapsed in Austria-Hungary, in Ottoman Turkey, in Germany, in Russia. All those empires were gone. The way that people had governed themselves ever since at least the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, was called into question in the defeated countries that had been part of the Central Powers. And even on the Allied side, everybody sort of understood that the world was never going to be quite the way that it was. There had been too much death, too much destruction, too much expenditure, and the old world order was going to be impossible to revive. In many places. Of course, the British and the French empires, the Japanese empires came out of the war stronger than they had been before. The Japanese, who had come into the conflict on the side of the Allies, had been given German colonies in the Pacific Ocean. The Marianas, for example, now belong to the Japanese instead of the Germans. The German sphere of influence in China had been handed over to the Japanese. These were mandates. They were not pure transfers of sovereign authority, which irritated the Japanese, who were also angry that an attempt to put a clause in the Treaty of Versailles that recognized the equality of all races had been shot down. Australia and New Zealand had done the work, but of course they were seen as speaking on behalf of the British Empire and indeed the white nations of the world who still had empires when World War I was over. And so the Japanese are going to be embittered by this treaty. So even though they're on the Allied side in World War I, they're going to turn out to be on the other side in World War II, and the reason for that sort of begins here. It begins here with disenchantment with the Treaty of Versailles. The same thing can be said of the Italians. The Italians, you may remember, before World War I broke out, had been allied with Germany, but they had not come into the war until 1915. Basically, they had played both sides off against the other to see which power bloc, the Central Powers or the Allied powers, would give the Italians the best deal for jumping into the conflict. Turned out that the Allies had been willing to offer more, but Italy's contribution to the war had not been a good one. The Italians had basically been stalemated by the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans in the mountains at the northern tip of Italy. They fought battle after battle after battle there, and the enormous casualties, as we are accustomed to when we talk about World War I battles, that hadn't really contributed much to the Allied cause. When the Germans beat up the Italians and ruptured their line and threatened to knock them out of the war in 1918. The Allies, the British and the French and even the Americans had to rush troops in to save the Italians. And so as a consequence of that, the Italians did not get many spoils in the Treaty of Versailles. They had been promised a great deal of new territory that would come at the expense of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire had basically held the Italians in check, and the Allies in England and France therefore perceived that Italy had been more of a burden than a help, and thus the Italians did not get much in the way of reward. You broke the Austro-Hungarian Empire up into the countries of Austria and Hungary, and then you took all the rest of that mess and created, that had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Kosovo and Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and these places, and you cobbled them together into a new country called Yugoslavia, which was another attempt by the Europeans to take this very problematic part of the world, the Balkans, and find a way to put it in a jar and keep a lid on it so it might not cause other problems. Of course, the Germans had lost an enormous amount of territory as a result of the war. The territory that they had won from Russia, when they forced Russia out of the war, was taken away from the Germans, but it wasn't given back to the new Soviet Union, that communist country, of course, which terrified the Western democracies. Instead, that land recreated the ancient kingdom of Poland. You built Czechoslovakia out of land taken from Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the former Russian Empire. The countries of Estonia and Lithuania were recreated. Those northern Baltic states were recreated as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So this angers the Soviets. It embitters, of course, the Germans, and it's in addition to all the other provisions in the Treaty of Versailles that required Germany to accept guilt for starting the war, pay enormous reparations, forbid it from having an army of more than 100,000 men, no air force, no tanks, no submarines, only a very small navy. All of this was designed to keep the Germans down, but not designed to keep them down permanently, because one of the ironies in all of this is that Germany was the country in Western Europe best situated to try and counter the Bolshevik Revolution in the newly proclaimed Soviet Union. So you didn't want Germany to be a completely weak state. You wanted it to be something of a bulwark for Western Europe against the communist, but trying to find a way to balance that was going to be very, very tricky, especially since the republic that had replaced the German monarchy was extremely unstable. It kind of did okay for a while in the 1920s, but you were taking people who were used to living in a monarchy, who were very proud of their country, very nationalist. Remember that Germany had only been created in 1870. They had done extremely well from a military perspective during most of World War I, and so that defeat was actually something of a very great shock to them. And then, to lose Alsace and Lorraine back to the French. Remember Alsace and Lorraine, those provinces, German-speaking provinces just to the west of the Rhine River in what is now France, had been apprised that the Germans had won in the Franco-Prussian War. Now those went back to the French, and you had a zone on the eastern bank of the Rhine River called the Rhineland, which was demilitarized. The Germans weren't allowed to have armed forces in there at all. And of course, what that means is that the Rhineland is supposed to be a buffer between France and Belgium and Germany, even a weak Germany. So the Germans are unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. The Italians are unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. The Soviets are unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. The Japanese are unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. And the Americans are unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. We explored very briefly the fact that Woodrow Wilson, by attending the Paris Peace Conference, had basically robbed himself of the ability to be the moral authority of the treaty, to sort of stand back, to stand aloof from the negotiations, and then look at the entire package that came out of the Paris Peace Conference, and either accept it or reject it, judging it in its totality. But Wilson had instead, by going to the Paris Peace Conference, become one of the architects. He had been part of the wheeling and the dealing and the horse trading, so that he could not reject it. And we remember that Wilson had backed off a lot of the things he had wanted in the treaty, or had reduced their scope or their ambition in order to get a League of Nations, which he considered to be critical to ensuring that World War I had indeed been fought as the war to end all wars. And the key component of the League of Nations, of course, was the idea that this is where international disputes would be resolved peacefully. But if that did not work, then the League of Nations was supposed to provide for collective security. In other words, if anybody threatened the peace of the world, if anybody became an aggressor anywhere in the world, then all the countries of the League of Nations would gang up on them and punish them. And of course, the threat of that was thought to be sufficient to deter aggression. And of course, that is a very lovely idea. The United Nations that's going to be created in the wake of World War II aspires to the same kind of principle, but the world's going to find out with both the League of Nations and the United Nations that it really doesn't work that way, that countries have interests. They have permanent interests, not permanent friends, and the willingness to send your young men, and now your young women, to go fight anywhere in the world, to put down aggression when it is perceived, sounds really good. But when the time comes to spend blood, to spend money in places that are far, far away, that maybe your countrymen have never heard of before, that don't seem to be really important or central to your own country's security or its own interest, either economic or otherwise, it's a lot harder thing to do. And the U.S. Senate had rejected that part of the Treaty of Versailles, Article 20, it was called. They had said, and correctly, that signing on to the treaty would strip the U.S. of the right of a sovereign nation to decide whether or not to deploy its armed forces, and when and where to deploy its armed forces, and surrender that power to an international body. And it had been on this issue primarily that resistance to the League had been mounted, and it was on this issue that any hope of getting the League of Nations treaty, the Treaty of Versailles that created the League of Nations, ratified in the U.S. Senate, had died. And so the U.S. never joins the League of Nations as a result. We never ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We make a separate peace with the Austrians and the Hungarians, and with the Germans. And this means that the U.S. is not going to be a participant in the League of Nations. And that suited a lot of Americans just fine, because it didn't take long for most of the country to decide that our participation in World War I, although we were very proud of what our soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen had done, we were proud of our Army and our Navy and their leaders and this sort of thing. There was a lot of military glory there that we embraced, but the ultimate outcome of the war was not the fair last lasting, just peace that Woodrow Wilson had promised. It did not look like World War I, still called the Great War at this point, had really become a war to end all wars. It certainly didn't look like it had been a war to make the world safe for democracy. It looked like it had been a war that had spawned chaos in Central Europe and in Asia. It looked like a war that had unleashed the very scary and disturbing forces of Bolshevism, communism, if you prefer, and socialism into the atmosphere. And it was a war that primarily seemed to have enlarged the British and French empires, who took colonies away from Germany and made them their own, of course. And then the other thing that the war does is to remake this map of the Middle East. So, Turkey's reduced to its modern borders. You get Lebanon, you get Syria, you get Iraq, you get Saudi Arabia, you get Palestine. All of these things are born out of the Europeans' effort to shuffle the map and shuffle colonies and spheres of influence in what today we would call the Middle East. And all of that, at least at the time, looked like it accrued to the benefit of England and France primarily. And so it seemed to us that we had fought and died. We had spent money to make Britain and France bigger and to make them stronger, and that was even more galling because although right when the war ended, England and France were willing to acknowledge the vital contribution of the United States in the last year of the war, they quickly changed their tune, and the story became, well, we really didn't need you. It was nice that you came. Yeah, you made things easier, but we were going to win the war anyway. This is not true from any objective standpoint. The American contribution, although it did come relatively late in the war, had been a key component in allowing the Allies to withstand the German offensives in 1918 and to assume the offensive that led to the armistice that November. But Americans definitely got the impression that their role in World War I was being denigrated. And so there was a lot of discontent here, maybe a feeling that we had been duped by it all. And certainly this created no desire amongst the Americans to stay involved in the world. And in fact, the United States had always been happy to remain aloof from the affairs of Europe. We had not been able to successfully disentangle quickly after the Revolution, and so we were sort of sucked in to the wars, between England and France and the rest of Europe, the Napoleonic Wars. Our own War of 1812 was a component of those wars. But after the War of 1812 was over, the United States is more than happy to concentrate on affairs at home. Even its foray into colony acquisition is relatively limited and designed primarily to protect and guarantee American trade across the Pacific. And except for that brief 113-day war with Spain, the U.S. had stayed clear of European affairs, and now it goes back there. Americans begin to more and more distance themselves from what's going on in Europe, which looks like it's getting increasingly dangerous and messy, and at any rate, not our problem. Not our problem. We deal with our own issues. We're going to stay involved in the Pacific because we have property there. We have colonies that need to be protected. We have trade that needs to be watched out for. But in terms of Europe, the Europeans have made a mess of everything. And we went over there, we bailed them out, we paid our debt to France, and now just leave us alone. We don't want any part of your squabbles. And of course, during the 1920s, the Americans, were dealing with difficulties in their own country. The Red Scare, the rural counterattack, the implementation of prohibition, these sorts of things, but also the great economic boom that came in the 20s. And so, that meant that there was even less of an appetite to worry about what was going on in Europe, and even not a lot of interest paid to what's going on in the Pacific by the ordinary American citizen. Something the government could deal with, is something that the diplomats and military people could keep an eye on. The average American really didn't care, so the U.S. is beginning to back away from world affairs as you go deeper and deeper into the 1920s, and then in 1929 you get the Great Depression. And once the country tumbles into that economic catastrophe, then any interest in getting involved in what's going on in Europe is reduced to zero. And one of the ways that you wanted to try and find money in the budget to deal with the needed social programs that the New Deal is going to throw out is to reduce military expenditures. The Great Depression is also going to need scapegoats, and of course big corporations, big businesses were ready scapegoats. Americans still had in their DNA that trust busting suspicion of the robber barons and these sorts of things, and so as the depths of the Great Depression sweep across the country, America as a whole is apathetic to what's going on in the rest of the world. It's unable because of its economic duress and its military weakness, because that big army we had built to fight World War I was demobilized almost immediately, and the American army shrank in size until it was the 13th ranked army in the world. So our ability to get involved was much less than it had been, but of course none of that mattered because we were unwilling to get involved. And there was a revulsion against the trench warfare of World War I, the horrors of the First World War that swept across Europe as well as America. The Europeans were acutely conscious. An entire generation of young men had seemingly been wiped out in the World War I trench stalemate. And many of the veterans were bitter about the way that they had been led, the strategies that had been employed, the purpose for which the war had been fought, and the reasons it had been prolonged. This was particularly true in Germany, but obviously it was true in England and France as well. You had books like All Quiet on the Western Front that came out and were turned into a very popular movie that were realistic, gritty view of the war and the horrors of that war from the perspective of frontline soldiers, that stripped away all the glamour and the glory of combat and didn't look at generals and didn't look at strategy and this sort of thing, and that made people even more determined to stay out of another war like that, to have nothing to do with what was going on in Europe if we could. Pacifism in the United States swept through college campuses. A poll that was taken by Brown University in the 1930s found that 72% of college students opposed serving in the military, even in wartime. There were anti-war rallies every spring all throughout the 1930s. And Congress, of course, gets involved in this, feeling the popular mood, sensing the suspicion and the unhappiness with corporations who were, in part being blamed for the Great Depression. Congress began a series of investigations into war profiteering. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota spent 2 years on it. Nye put forward what he called the Merchants of Death thesis, basically arguing that the real reason that the U.S. got involved in World War I wasn't, German violations of American neutrality. It wasn't unrestricted submarine warfare. It was the fact that the United States had lent so much money to the Allied powers, that they owed us so much money for all the munitions and armaments that we had produced for them, that we had to go to war to ensure they won, because that was the only way to guarantee that they would ever pay back those loans or pay those debts. And therefore, it was American arms manufacturers who had led President Wilson by the nose into declaring World War I. So it was the bankers and the arms merchants who had brought on that war, and this merchants of death thesis struck a chord with a certain segment of the public. And of course, no proof of that was ever found, because there was no proof to be found, but it was revealed that the armaments manufacturers had made enormous profits during the war. And of course they had. The English and the French had needed American factories to make things for them. The Americans were in a position to charge basically whatever they wanted, and therefore enormous profits were to be made. But this feeling, this suspicion of the armaments industry is going to be very important, because as World War I fades into memory and the clouds of World War II begin to gather on the horizon, Americans are going to be determined not to fall into the same trap. Not to get sucked into Europe's next series of wars in the same way that they believed that they had been sucked into the First World War. So this is kind of what's going on in the United States. The country is turning toward what is called isolationism. Isolationism, that's actually a little bit inaccurate a term. We certainly weren't being isolationist in the Pacific. We were not being isolationist in the Caribbean or in the Western Hemisphere, where we continued to be the dominant power and intended to stay that way. But isolationist in a sense of European affairs and not getting involved in what was happening to the French or the Germans or the Italians or the English or the Soviets or something like that. And of course, Americans were divided on all of this. We can't say that all Americans felt the same way. That's certainly not true. But by and large, what most Americans wanted to do was not to think about it at all, not to worry about it, not our problem. And that meant it was no concern of the United States. As the fascists, the Nazis, came to power in Europe, as the communists consolidated their power in the Soviet Union, and the militarist rose to power in Japan. And now, of course, each of these things is its own fascinating story, well worthy of study, to see how intelligent, educated, enlightened countries with impressive cultures could fall under the sway of these kind of movements. It's the sort of thing, that the people of those countries would tell you, oh, well, it couldn't happen here. It couldn't happen to us. That's always a dangerous thing to say, because, of course, it can happen to anybody. Liberty is something that has to be guarded. It has to be protected. The things that we enshrine in the Bill of Rights are not guaranteed forever simply because they've been put on a piece of paper and they've been protected and adhered to, for a couple of centuries. There are always new dangers, new threats, unscrupulous people. There are always new causes, and they have the same name, but inevitably they have the same goal, and that is to short-circuit democratic debate, to short-circuit the political messiness of a democracy, to silence the opposition, to sweep the troublemakers out of the way, to control the press, to silence free speech, to have the government seize control of the media, of the education system, of the economy, and run it all in a dictatorial way to achieve the tenets of the party. Under the leadership usually of a one-man dictatorship, and the goal of the party, the goal of the dictator, is always expressed as wanting to protect human rights, to defend the country, to beat back the threats to the nation, to ensure equality and fairness, and to punish those who had manipulated the system, to seize control, to punish the elites, and these sorts of things. So these kind of movements communism, fascism, socialism in the way that it has been practiced in some countries around the world, Nazism, militarism, all of these things, say the right words. But that paints them as wolves in sheep's clothing, because once you say that you need to give power to the government, you need to give power to the individual to deal with these problems, to deal with these threats, then you're setting up a system to where you are handing one group of people the ability to decide what's going to be done, how it's going to be done, to ignore public sentiment, to silence opposition ruthlessly, and not just in a political sense, but often in a violent sense, and all of it justifiable because you have to break a few eggs to make the omelet. A few people, or maybe a few thousand, or maybe a few 100,000 people have to die for the greater good, so we can move upward into the wonderland of the pure, utopian state or something like this. But anytime that you give any group of people the power to decide for everyone, to dictate to everyone, to determine for everyone, to shut down debate, to silence opposing voices, to suppress free speech, whenever you allow mob rule and rule by gangs and thugs who do things in such a way that you're going to let them run rampant in the streets in support of certain political kind of goals, to achieve certain kinds of political goals, and that sort of thing, then you have lost liberty. You've lost democracy, and this is what's going to happen in Europe. It is what's going to happen in Asia. It's going to happen first in Italy. Italy had been a monarchy. It becomes a socialist republic in the aftermath of World War I. The Italians, of course, are very bitter about the Treaty of Versailles and angry, therefore, at the French and at the British. But there was a lot of social and economic chaos in Italy, and this is where a man named Benito Mussolini came in. He organized what was called the Fascist Party, and the fascist embraced the idea of a dictatorship in order to snuff out all of the messiness of opposing political parties, to deal with the threat of the communists, to snuff out the agitation of the labor unions, which were seen as allies, as the communists, to silence the critical press, these sorts of things. They formed what were called black shirt groups, their distinctive black shirts, and while Mussolini and the ringleaders of this pushed forward on the political front, the black shirts took to killing, beating, silencing, intimidating, terrorizing those who would oppose them. And so they struck fear into the middle class. They terrified the elites and the industrialists and these sorts of things. And you got into a situation to where there was so much anarchy, there was so much chaos, there was so much violence that the Italian people were willing to accept Mussolini if he could restore order. So the fascists managed to intimidate the Italian king into asking Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini comes to power in 1922, and he has support of a lot of the Italian people, and he kind of has his own version of the New Deal in a way, because he begins a bunch of public works programs, puts people to work, dams rivers, solves all kinds of economic problems. As it's said, Mussolini made the trains trains run on time, and this restored Italian pride in the aftermath of the disappointing end of World War I. Mussolini was an incredibly talented speaker. He was a charismatic fellow, and although a lot of times what he said was contradictory, didn't make a lot of sense, his facts were sometimes wrong, he could captivate a crowd. He could impart to them his mood, if you will, and that mood was that we are going to unite Italy, we're going to make Italy prosperous, we're going to make Italy great again by recreating the Italian Empire. The Italian Empire from the days of Rome. We're going to recreate the Roman Empire. The Italian forays into colony making in the 19th century had not gone well. The Italians have the distinction of being the only European army ever to be defeated in a war by an indigenous people. That happened in Ethiopia, and so Mussolini basically intends to even the score with the Ethiopians. He's going to recreate a Italian empire in the form of Rome along the north coast of North Africa, or the southern coast of the Mediterranean, and at least for a while, for probably about a decade, Mussolini is going to be seen as somebody who is good for Italy. He's going to be the dominant of the new European dictators. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis are going to come to power a bit later, but they're going to come to power out of the same kind of issues. There was a very weak republic. You had a parliamentary democracy. No one party could really consolidate power. The Bolsheviks, the Social Democrats, the Nazis, and other right-wing parties were duking it out, not just politically and electorally, but their gangs, their armed and uniformed paramilitary units were literally fighting battles in the streets. And these are all mostly World War I veterans. They know their stuff. There's lots of weaponry around, and so there's pitched battles in the streets. People are killed, people are wounded. Of course, this is all very appalling to the German people, many of whom are terrified that the Bolshevik Revolution is going to take root in Germany. The Reds, or the Communists, aka the Bolsheviks, are more interested in destroying the Social Democratic Party because it's perceived as a competitor to the communist for the loyalties of the workers, and so it's a real mess. And then the Great Depression makes everything worse. It knocks the bottom out from under the German economy. The German currency depreciated into nothingness. It was said that you took a wheelbarrow full of money to the market, and you carried back what you bought with that in a purse. Prices were outlandish. People were unemployed. There was hunger. There was starvation, and the Nazi Party capitalized on that. The Nazi is an acronym. Nazi stands for National Socialist German Workers' Party. So the Nazis are socialist, or a form of socialist. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi if you take the German spelling of that and make it an acronym. And Adolf Hitler, who was like Mussolini, he was a fantastic speaker. He was somebody who had his pulse, or his thumb rather, on the pulse of the German people, understood their desire to repudiate and recover from the Treaty of Versailles, to make Germany great again, the need of Germans to righten their economic ship of state, to bring order and stability, law and order, to get rid of the chaos in the street, to put down the communists, and also, it turns out, to punish those who Hitler and the Nazis, and a lot of Germans believe this, had stabbed the German army in the back. during World War II. They argued that the German army really hadn't been defeated on the Western Front. It was revolution at home that had caused the collapse of the German war effort, and there was just enough truth to that to make it a viable opinion. And so the Nazis actually come to power like the fascists as sort of a dual track. They do it politically. They're never a majority, but they do win a plurality of the seats in the German parliament, known as the Reichstag. That means there are more Nazis than there are anybody else, although the Nazis are not a majority. But also this action in the street, these assassinations, these attacks on political opponents, this the intimidation of what in Germany were brown shirts. So the Italians had black shirts, the Germans had brown shirts, who were a paramilitary force controlled by the Nazi Party, who would ruthlessly intimidate the opposition. All of this eventually led Hitler to being appointed the Chancellor of Germany, and when the President of Germany, the famous World War I General Paul von Hindenburg, dies in office, Hitler becomes the ruler of Germany, and the Nazi Party manages to, through electoral politics, codify his position as the Führer, or the leader of Germany. But Hitler does kind of the same thing that Mussolini does, and that is he quickly puts an end to the violence. He restores law and order. He promises to make Germany great again, and he begins to repudiate elements of the Treaty of Versailles, very carefully at first, but then ever more aggressively, and he begins rearming Germany in a whole series of public works and these sorts of things, and this allows Germany to recover from the Great Depression faster than the United States recovers from the Great Depression. A return to prosperity and law and order meant that most Germans were willing to accept Hitler and the Nazis. They didn't like everything about them. There were things that were distasteful, but a lot of people reasoned it away, that this was, this is just rhetoric, this is political posturing. The industrialists and the manufacturers and the elites of society believed that, once Hitler had power, they could control him. Even the Jewish population of Germany initially was not unduly concerned about Hitler and the Nazis. Their anti-Semitic rhetoric was pretty vile, but it wasn't that. It was different in degree, but perhaps not in tone to the anti-Semitic attitudes that could be found throughout Europe and, in fact, most of the world. Japan is a little bit different question. Japan had an emperor, and although the Japanese have a parliament and some sort of elective government, in fact, the military controlled things in Japan. The military was basically a political force in Japan, and what the Japanese were most interested in was expanding into China. Of course, where the American open door policy is still officially in place. The British have Hong Kong, the Americans and others have presence there. But the real challenge to the Japanese in China was the Soviet Union. Remember, the Japanese and the Russians had fought each other in the Russo-Japanese War at the dawn of the 20th century, and so there was a really tense standoff between those two. China as a country was very weak. It itself was on its way to falling into the throes of civil war between communists led by a fellow named Mao Zedong and nationalists led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. And the Japanese were very aggressive. They saw in China their manifest destiny of Japan, which is an island nation bereft of most natural resources required by an industrial let alone a military power. If Japan was going to be the great power that it aspired to be, then it was going to have to obtain those natural resources, food, living space, these kinds of things, and that could best be found in China. The Japanese were virulent racist. They had conquered, of course, Korea in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and most Japanese saw Koreans as not even human beings, and they saw Chinese as subhumans. One of the things that both the Japanese are embracing, and of course the Nazis embraces this idea of a master race, a superior race. If not born that way, then it could be made that way. Hitler was a big believer in eugenics, and so part of the ideology here of Nazis and Japanese militarists and Italian fascists is a perversion of the progressive desire to make the world more scientific, to make the world more orderly, to make the world more fair, to make the human race better. These ideas were, of course, commendable until they're taken to extremes. How far are you willing to go? How are you going to define those things? How are you going to obtain the power to accomplish these things and direct that power? That's where ideas that are laudatory in their expression and in their goal can become terrifyingly dangerous when they are implemented by certain kinds of people in certain ways where there's no inhibiting factor about democracy, human dignity, that sort of thing. And so you get the rise of these three countries that are going to wind up destabilizing the world. So, Mussolini comes to power in 1922. Hitler comes to power in 1933. The militarists had come to power in Japan in the late 20s. In the early 30s, and from really the mid-30s forward, these countries are going to embark upon an ever-escalating course of aggression. And they're going to test the League of Nations on this idea of collective security, and they're going to find that the Western democracies talk a good game, but are not willing to actually act in a way that might threaten war. So in 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. And it's a very brutal invasion. The Italian army, of course, is a modern army, tanks, airplanes. It uses poison gas against the Ethiopians. And by 1936, Ethiopia has been conquered by the Italians. And that same year, Germany begins repudiating the Treaty of Versailles, begins national conscription. The Germans are secretly sending pilots to other countries to train so that they know how to fly planes. The Germans are being very circumspect about here, but the circumspection is not going to last very long. In 1936, in March of 1936, Hitler sends a couple of German battalions to reoccupy the Rhineland. So here's the first truly aggressive move by Hitler. German troops march over the border. The German army is still very small. It has no tanks. It has no airplanes. And it's just a handful of troops, really. And Hitler has given them secret orders that there's the first sign of resistance from France or England, they are to retreat back across the border. But there is no resistance from France or England. The idea here is that, well, this is Germany, and the Germans are entitled to have military forces there. Remember, we don't want Germany to be so weak that it can't be a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Maybe the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, and so Hitler is allowed to get away with this. This same year, a civil war breaks out in Spain. It's going to rage until 1939. It's a very nasty, ugly civil war between a nationalist government and a communist bloc. The Spanish Civil War is a very complex thing, but it became a proxy war in a sense, because the Germans sent troops to fight for one side, and the Russians, the communists, sent troops to fight for another. This was a chance for some real-world military training, for some experimentation in tactics, especially with aerial and tank warfare and this sort of thing. And so the world's becoming ever more destabilized is here. In 1936, that November, Italy and Germany formally agreed to an alliance. They created what are known as the Axis powers, A-X-I-S, the Axis powers. Initially, it's Italy and Germany. Japan will join, and they will become the force of aggression that's going to bring on the Second World War. Hitler claimed that all he wanted to do was to recover all of the territory containing German-speaking people that had been lost in the Treaty of Versailles. And so in 1938, Germany merged with Austria. So Austria ceases to become an independent country later that year, so that's in March of 1938. September 1938, Hitler, after a crisis with England and France, is going to gain even more territory because he demands that the new country of Czechoslovakia hand over much of its northern and western border region, known as the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland, and for spelling, I look at the list of terms that I'm going to send you here. The Sudetenland happened to contain all of the militarily defensible terrain on the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia. Most of the Czech armaments industry happened to be there. It's border defenses. But Hitler threatened war if the Sudetenland was not turned over by Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia's sovereignty was guaranteed by England and France, and it looked like this might be the moment. The French actually were willing to stand up to the Hitler here, and it might have provoked a European war. And of course, this was a terrifying thought to a lot of people, because when they thought about another European war, what popped into their mind's eye was a replay of the trench warfare of World War I. And a lot of people were desperate to avoid that, and among them was the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, who went to Munich with the Premier of France, Paul Renault, and they came to an agreement with Hitler and Mussolini that would turn the Sudetenland over to the Germans with the guarantee from Hitler that this was the last territory that he wanted. Once he got the Sudetenland, he was good. And Chamberlain flew home, got off a plane, famously waved the treaty in front of the news cameras and said that it represented peace in our time. But of course it did no such thing. But one of the reasons that Hitler could be so aggressive toward England and France over the Sudetenland was that the year before, in 1937, he had signed an anti-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This was a giant shock to everybody because communists and Nazis were natural enemies, the forces of the far right and the far left, and it was always believed by the leaders of Western Europe that this fear of communists for Nazis and Nazis for communists would balance those two countries out. It would sort of freeze them in place, and their confrontation with each other would leave neither one of them with the resources to cause trouble elsewhere. But when Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, who has his own economic difficulties to deal with, agrees to a non-aggression pact with Hitler, well, then Hitler sort of freed up to be more aggressive in the West. And as all of this stuff is going down in in Europe, the Japanese are stepping up their aggression in Asia. They have really been pushing things since 1931, but in July of 1937, the Japanese army, against really the wishes of the civilian government in Tokyo, orchestrated an incident near the border between the Japanese sphere of influence and actual Chinese territory, not far from Peking, or Beijing, as we would say today, at the Marco Polo Bridge, as a Japanese unit looking for a man who had gone missing want to cross the bridge. The Chinese tell them they can't. A skirmish breaks out that evolves eventually into a great big battle and becomes the pretext for a full-scale Japanese invasion of China, that part of China under actual control of the Chinese government. And so most people think of World War II breaking out in Europe when the Germans invade Poland in September of 1939. That's really not true. It is in China in 1937, the summer of 1937, where the first military action that will become World War II takes place, because, of course, the Japanese are going to continue to fight in China all the way until the end of the war in 1945. So the war actually starts in Asia and will merge with a war that begins in Europe, and from there will spread around the entire world. The Japanese invasion of China was incredibly brutal. In December of 1937, the Japanese took the city of Nanking and committed incredible atrocities there. They deliberately slaughtered tens of thousands of people. There were thousands upon thousands of rapes of Chinese women. Japanese soldiers took Chinese civilians and tied them up on stakes and used them as for bayonet practice while they were still alive. This is appalling stuff. And of course, the United States was there to witness it firsthand, because we still had interest in China. And so we had an American naval presence near Nanking on the Yangtze River, an American gunboat named the USS Panay, which during the battle for Nanking was dive bombed and sunk by Japanese aircraft. Even though the weather was good, the ship was flying the American flag. It was believed that this was done deliberately. 48 American sailors were wounded in the attack, and 2 were killed. That threatened to, drag the U.S. and Japan into war, but the Japanese at this point had no interest in war with the U.S., so they apologized, they paid reparations, they cashiered the commander who had been in charge of the unit that had attacked the Panay. And all of this stuff was, of course, very shocking, but Americans are caught in the depths of the Great Depression. FDR's New Deal is just now having its mini recession. Remember, FDR gets elected in 1932, gets reelected in 1936, and not long after he's reelected, the country slides backward into a depression. That Merchants of Death thesis is still, bumping around out there, and as a consequence of that, the reaction of the American people is actually to take steps to ensure that we're not going to get drugged into this war the way that we were drugged into the next war. So the Congress begins to pass a series of what are called neutrality acts. Neutrality acts. So the first of these becomes law in 1935, and it bans the sale of arms to nations at war and warns American ships to stay off, or warns American citizens to stay off the ships of warring powers. And it's very easy to see that this is a reaction to what was perceived to have brought the United States into World War I. And there are going to be more neutrality acts that follow. that are going to tighten the screws, make it harder and harder for Americans to loan money to these warring powers or to ship goods to them. And this is something that FDR thought was a mistake. He didn't like it, but he was embroiled in fighting to preserve the New Deal, and so he couldn't really resist this very much. But he is going to find ways to try and get around it. For example, the Japanese, when they attacked China in 1937, did not declare war on China. And although they were obviously very much at war, the fact that there had been no official declaration of war allowed FDR to authorize the sale of American arms and munitions to the Chinese government because technically speaking, from a very narrow legalistic standpoint, that was not a violation of the Neutrality Acts. And so Americans watched all of this play out with increasing nervousness. And of course, Hitler, Mussolini, the Japanese militarist, under the new head of the Japanese government, a general by the name of Tojo, become emboldened by the failure of the democracies and the League of Nations to do anything about this. The League of Nations scolded it, condemned. There were attempts at economic sanctions imposed upon the Italians and the Japanese, for example, but these tended away from being harsh enough to actually, bite and require these countries to pull in their horns, because the fear was that if these were sanctions that actually could be felt, that might provoke war, and avoiding war was the thing more than anything else that everybody wanted to do. In 1939, Hitler went back on his promise and drove in and occupied all of Czechoslovakia. That caused the British and the Italians the British and the French to guarantee the security of Poland, which is kind of ironic because it would have been militarily possible for England and France to have intervened on behalf of Czechoslovakia, but they didn't. They took Hitler at his word. He very quickly proved to them that his word could not be trusted. So you guarantee the security of Poland. But Poland's on the other side of Germany. It's between Germany and the Soviet Union. And so there was militarily little that England and France could actually do if the Germans attacked Poland, except to promise to have a big war with the Germans. And so the tensions are rising on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And how is the U.S. Responding to it? Well, the U.S. Responds by beginning to take some measures. In 1938, in response to what's been going on, the Congress enacted a law, the Navy Act of 1938, which authorized a 20% increase in the size of the United States Navy. This is a pretty modest thing, but it means that we're going to start building warships. We're going to be designing them. This is a good thing because there's a long lead time on building warships. And among the ships that are going to be built are some new battleships. The first new battleships that the U.S. is going to build in the last 17 years. And so the war here, or the Americans are beginning to respond to what's going on, respond to nervousness about what is happening in the world, but it's a tentative response. And of course, things simply go from bad to worse. In April of 1939, Italy had invaded Albania on the other side of the Adriatic Sea, conquered it in the span of a week. And then on September 1st of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And using a combination of swift-moving armored columns and aerial attack, they drove deep into Poland. The Soviet Union, which has this non-aggression pact with Germany, is able, aids and abets the attack on Poland on September 17th. It invades Poland from the east, and so Poland is overrun and surrenders on October 1st. And the next month, the Soviets invade Finland, and that fight goes on until March of 1940, when the Finnish are forced to make concessions in response to the German invasion of Poland. England and France declare war on Germany. Everybody mobilizes, and everybody, of course, expects a replay of World War I. But instead, what the Germans do in April of 1940 is to overrun Denmark, which had been neutral through World War I, and launch a naval invasion of Norway. And this completely catches everybody by surprise. A British effort to throw the Germans out fails. Norway falls to the Germans. That forces Neville Chamberlain out of office, and Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister of England, one of the great British statesmen of all time, a key figure in the history of World War II. Churchill had been warning everybody all throughout the 1930s that Hitler especially and Mussolini could not be trusted. He warned that sooner or later you're going to have to deal with these people. As he put it, trying to appease dictators is like the person who feeds the alligator, hoping that the alligator eats them last. But sooner or later, the alligator is going to come after you, and so Hitler had basically been proven correct. In May of 1940, the Germans launched their invasion of France and Belgium and Luxembourg. And the Germans, German army is not bigger than the French and the British army. It does not have as many tanks. It does not have as many airplanes. From a pure technical standpoint, its airplanes are no better than those of the British and the French. German tanks, many of them are actually inferior to those of the British and the French, but the German army was better led, and everybody expects it to do what it had done in World War I, and that was try and sweep through Belgium to come down on France from the north, and the Allies, the English and the French, having learned their lesson in World War I, were ready to meet that. So when the Germans began to move, they marched into Belgium. The British and the French armies rushed into Belgium to fight them there on that territory, and once the British and the bulk of the French, the bulk of the British and a good chunk of the French army had rushed into Belgium, the Germans came through the very steeply wooded terrain of the Ardennes, which is on the border between Belgium and Luxembourg, and they broke through the French front, and the upshot of it is that within a month, France was beaten. The British were forced to withdraw their army from France before it could be destroyed. They did that at Dunkirk, and after this, the Italians declare war on France in June of 1940. I don't really get into the fighting until it's all over, but France has been brought to its knees, and Belgium has been overrun, Denmark has been overrun, Norway has been overrun, Luxembourg has been overrun. The French Navy, the French colonies are out of the war, and England basically stands alone. England stands alone, and this was a huge shock to the entire world. Nobody had expected this. This German onslaught, which newspapermen referred to as Blitzkrieg, which translates into lightning war. It was really German tactics, German strategy that had prevailed, not technological and certainly not numerical superiority, but nonetheless, this is reality. And how does the United States react to it? Well, Americans are divided. Some Americans see Hitler as no threat. They form something called an America First Committee that says, hey, let's don't worry about Europe's affairs. Let's look after ourselves. Other Americans say, hey, look, we've got to be prepared to defend ourselves in what is an increasingly increasingly dangerous world. So you have a committee to defend America by aiding the Allies with all assistance short of war. And so America First says stay out of it. Hitler's really not a threat. Totalitarian government is the wave of the future. And then you've got the other faction that says no, we've got to help the Allies, and if they can stand up to Hitler, then he can't threaten us. It reminds you of the divisions between Americans on the eve of World War I. But the reality of what the Germans done is undeniable, and the shock that the Soviet Union had played a hand in making all this happen. In June of 1940, the Soviets move in and annex the Baltic states. They force Romania to give over territory, so the Soviets seem to be aggressors now, as well as the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese. And the American response here, at least in the Congress, is to prepare for war, at least to defend the Western Hemisphere. So in the weeks after the fall of France, and as the German Air Force begins a campaign to try and bomb England into surrender, known as the Battle of Britain, that will go from July to October of 1940, the Congress begins to build up American military capability. In July of 1940, something called the Two-Ocean Navy Act is passed, and that provides for a 70% increase in the size of the United States Navy. So this is in addition to the previous Navy Act in 1936. And it passes unanimously through the House of Representatives after a mere 4 hours of debate. The Two-Ocean Navy Act would add 257 ships to the American Navy, including 8 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 33 cruisers, 115 destroyers, 43 submarines, and 15,000 aircraft. It would cost $8.5 billion to bring all that into fruition. And so the U.S. is beginning to rearm here, not necessarily to get involved in the war, but to be prepared to defend ourselves if the Germans wind up triumphing. Now, all of this has a pretty strong impact on America outside of the diplomatic and military realm. Two very important things are going to come out of all of this. American isolationism is going to begin to weaken. Not going to collapse yet, but it begins to weaken. And the beginning of government expenditures on rearmament. And in November of 1940, the President Roosevelt is going to call up the National Guard for a year of military service. We're going to reinstitute the draft. That's going to revive the American economy. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression. World War II ends the Great Depression. The spending on armaments, the taking of ultimately 16 million young men and women out of the civilian workforce and putting them in the military is going to end unemployment. It's going to give people jobs, well-paying jobs. The economy is going to go into hyperdrive once we are in the war. And the factories are going to run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The production of civilian goods is basically going to disappear. So people are making lots of money, and they have literally almost nothing to spend it on except food and entertainment and necessities like housing. And so this is going to create a vast amount of wealth that's going to be available to be spent in the post-war era, going to help to fuel the economic prosperity of the 1950s and the 1960s. And so rearmament and mobilization are going to lift the U.S. finally out of the Great Depression. Suddenly facing problems on the diplomatic and military stage gave Franklin Delano Roosevelt the opening to do something that he otherwise could not even have attempted, and that was to run for a third term as President of the United States. Remember, there is no constitutional prohibition against how many times a person could run and be elected, but George Washington had set the precedent of 2 terms, and nobody had ever challenged that, although technically they could have. And remember that Teddy Roosevelt, when he runs for the Bull Moose Party, isn't actually trying to be elected to a 3rd term as president, because his first term was actually McKinley's 2nd term. So FDR gets nominated by the Democrats for the presidency in 1940, and basically the country has come to trust him. He argues this is a really bad time to change leadership. The world's becoming an increasingly dangerous place, and so FDR wins. He wins a 3rd term as president. 4 years later, he will win a 4th term as president. So the only man ever to be elected more than twice to the presidency of the United States. And of course, in the 1950s, we're going to add the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution that's going to codify in constitutional law that 2 terms and that's it. That's all you can get. So FDR becomes the only American president ever to have more than 2 terms, and that would have not been possible if not for the outbreak of World War II. And as FDR, having won that term, he begins to be more aggressive in resisting the isolationist tendencies of Congress and the American people. FDR basically saw that the best way to keep the U.S. out of the war was to ensure that the countries that are fighting England are able to defeat it. Unfortunately, there's only one country fighting England right now, and that is Britain. And of course, Americans have a lot of sympathy for the British. Radio is now a common medium, and the German air attacks on England during the Battle of Britain are being reported. And people listening to some of this almost live. Famous reporters like Edward R. Murrow are doing a stellar job in not only telling people what's going on, but describing it in a way that people understand. And so sympathy is building for England. England is standing alone. England, of course, with its empire. So that means the Australians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, the Canadians are all fighting Germany. So when you say England alone, that creates a little bit of a misperception there. It's the British Empire that is fighting England alone. There's a real threat that there might be a German invasion, but the British victory in the Battle of Britain, the aerial victory there, is going to prevent the Germans from being able to fight their way through the much larger and more capable Royal Navy to try and land German troops on the English coast. So the British managed to stave off the threat of invasion, but they're still in desperate need of help. The Italians have invaded the British colony of Egypt, attacking out of the Italian colony of Libya on the coast of North Africa, things are looking bad. Things are looking bad all the way around. The Japanese have taken advantage of the fall of France to occupy the French colony of Indochina, what we today know as Vietnam. In September of 1940, the Japanese officially joined the Axis powers. Technically, it's called the Tripartite Pact, but the Axis powers is really the name of the coalition by what is going to be known. So how is FDR dealing with this? Things are going from bad to worse. In December of 1940, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia join as allies of the Axis power. Bulgaria will come in March of 41. Well, what FDR proposes to do is to have the United States become the arsenal of democracy. We're not going to get involved in this war, we're not going to fight it, but we're going to arm the forces that are fighting the Axis powers. Again, sort of reminiscent of World War I. Of course, this is, if we start making things for the British Empire, in this fight against the Axis powers, then, more Americans are going to go to work and factories are going to hum and money is going to be made. But how do you get around the Neutrality Acts that made it illegal to sell weapons and munitions to countries at war? It was illegal to loan them money these sorts of things. And so FDR responds to that by advancing what he calls lend-lease. Lend-lease. And so he gets around these prohibitions against, hey, you can't sell armaments to these warring powers by saying, well, we're not going to sell it to them, we're going to lend it to them. And lend it to them, and that's the impression, of course, that they're going to give it back. Of course, he knows that's not going to happen, that it can't happen, but there's the idea we're going to lend it to them, and in exchange for that, they're going to lease the United States military bases in the Western Hemisphere. So there are still some, British colonies in the Caribbean and that sort of stuff. And so they're going to lease us bases that we can occupy to defend the Western Hemisphere, and lend them stuff, not sell them stuff, so we're not violating the Neutrality Acts. And as he had done when he closed the banks, he got onto the radio in a fireside chat to reassure the American people what he was doing and explain it to them. Well, he does the same thing with Lend-Lease. He says, hey, look, if your neighbor's house on fire, he doesn't want you to fight the fire for him, but if he comes over to borrow your garden hose so that he can fight the fire, wouldn't you loan him the garden hose with the expectation that when the fire's out, he'll give you back your garden hose? And this is a very, straightforward way of explaining it. Everybody can understand, and it worked. The American people got it. And in March of 1941, a Lend-Lease bill passes through Congress, and ultimately some $7 billion worth of military equipment will go to England. By June of 1940, it's equal to half of all the military industrial output of the United States during that same period. So we're trying to rearm, but half of what we're producing is going to England. Churchill praised that. Churchill has a very close relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They're going to get along famously with each other, and it was a big boost for English morale. As Churchill said, quote, "The words and acts of the American president and the people of the United States come to us like a draught of life and tell us by an ocean-born trumpet that we are no longer alone. We are no longer alone." Well, we might be helping the English, we might be beginning to mobilize and to rearm, but the Axis tide of conquest continues to rise. In April of 1941, Germany and its allies overrun Yugoslavia. Then they go to the assistance of the Italians, who had invaded Greece and had not done very well. The Greeks were actually fighting them to a standstill, so the Germans had to go in and help them. And in all of this, of course, the Germans have resurrected unrestricted submarine warfare with new, longer-ranged, more capable submarines and more of them. They have initiated a new Battle of the Atlantic, trying to starve England into surrender. And this time the submarines can range way out into the Atlantic Ocean. Submarines will even be able to reach the coast of the United States, so it's not just a 100-mile zone around England anymore. German, and although the British go to the convoy thing first off here, the Germans are still enjoying a great deal of success, sinking ships at 3 times the capacity of England to build them, and more than 2 times the capacity of what the United States and England could build together. In May of 1941, some 500,000 tons of shipping were lost to the German U-boats, and that's with the German U-boats leaving American ships alone. Hitler is going to avoid a repetition of the unrestricted submarine warfare that had pulled the U.S. into World War I. At the end of May 1941, the first Lend-Lease convoy sails across the Atlantic. FDR declares an unlimited national emergency, extends U.S. Navy patrols into the mid-Atlantic, calls the National Guard into federal service for the span of a year. Some 300,000 men are therefore going to be mobilized. On June 22nd of 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union and initiates the biggest bloodbath of all of World War I. The bulk of the German army is going to be embroiled with the Soviets more than any other country throughout the course of the war. And you can get the sense that the cascade of bad news, of things happening here. The German blitzkrieg into Russia is going to come very close to capturing Moscow and winning the war. The Soviets are being beaten and they're suffering enormous losses. And in the backdrop of all of that, FDR and Churchill on August 9th, 1941, meet off the coast of Newfoundland. An American warship carries FDR to the meeting. A British warship carries Churchill. This is the first time that they've actually met face to face. They have an instant rapport. And they create something called the Atlantic Charter, which is interesting because it's almost a declaration of joint war goals, even though the United States is not at war. This is almost a statement of what democracies believe this war is about. And the Atlantic Charter says that neither the U.S. nor England, the British Empire, seek territorial gain from the war. They want people to be able to choose their own form of government around the world. They want people to be able to trade freely around the world with the goal of a higher standard of living for all. And they believe that all nations should abandon force as a means of solving disputes. So this sort of echoes, in a way, doesn't it, the 14 points. These are the great principles of democracy. And what FDR is probably expecting here is that the U.S. is going to find its way into the European war very much in the way that the U.S. found its way into World War I, that eventually the U-boat campaign is going to ensnare the United States. On September 4th of 1941, an American destroyer and a U-boat exchanged fire as U.S. merchant ships are carrying war material for Britain to Iceland, where it's transferred to British ships to sell the rest of the way. FDR threatens that any U-boat entering American waters or waters that are considered vital to American defense represent a threat, and he gives the Navy permission to fire on a U-boat on site. Doesn't have to be a provocation. The American public pretty much supports that. We're not going to let the Germans come into our waters. We're not going to let them, to threaten us. And FDR saw in that an opening. He goes to the Congress and asks it to repeal the Neutrality Acts. A little later, on October 17th, a German U-boat sank an American destroyer, the USS Kearney. 11 American sailors died. FDR declared that the U.S. has been attacked. And another American ship at the end of the month, the USS Reuben James, goes down. 115 Americans killed there. And although this is not going to lead the U.S. into the war, it's going to lead to a revision in November of the Neutrality Acts. American ships will now be allowed to sail to the ports of warring nation, and the Navy will be able to escort those ships into a war zone. We're going to arm American merchant ships so that they can protect themselves. And so we're taking some pretty big steps here, but none of this is quite yet going to be enough. The American people are still very reluctant. We're willing to be more robust in our defense of our seaborne flank on the Atlantic, if you will. We're willing to do more than help the British, but we're still not really looking to get involved. It's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot. And while everybody's attention is focused here in Europe, of course in Asia, things are going from very bad to much worse. The Japanese have already taken over Indochina after the fall of Holland. In the spring of 1940, Holland goes down with Luxembourg and Belgium and France. The Japanese take control of the Dutch territories. They proclaim something called a Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere that, on the surface is we're going to drive the colonial powers out, Asia for the Asians, but in fact what that means is that the Japanese intend to replace the colonial powers as the master of Asia. And so when the Japanese begin to do these things, they join the Axis power, FDR decides to retaliate. And he imposes a ban on the sale of iron and steel to the Japanese and threatens to ban oil. The U.S. was an oil exporter. Japan got most of its oil from the United States, so this was a real threat. If the U.S. cuts off the oil, the Japanese military machine, Japanese industry is going to grind to a halt, and what Roosevelt's hoping here is that this is going to be enough. It's going to convince the Japanese to halt their aggression in China, and what it in fact does, one, it proves popular. The American people approve of this, but it convinces the Japanese that they're either going to have to submit to the United States and abandon their dreams of empire and expansion in China, or they're going to have to go to war with the United States, and in order to make the Americans leave them alone and to capture the natural resources that Japan needs to be economically independent. So the American and Japanese, governments begin negotiations, both of them attempting to buy time here, but the Japanese government under General Tojo has already determined that what is necessary here is war against the United States. And so the Japanese begin to lay their plans. FDR moves the American fleet from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to rattle the American saber. We finally impose a complete oil embargo on the Japanese, and that's sort of for the Japanese the straw that's going to break the camel's back. And they now face that choice: do we submit to the Americans, or do we fight in order to secure our conquest in China and to conquer from the world the resources that Japan needs to be the great power that it is determined to be. And so that puts the U.S. And Japan on a collision course that is going to lead on December 7th of 1941 to the attack on Pearl Harbor that will propel the U.S. Into the war. But we're going to stop there. So a very down and dirty, big brushstroke look at what's going on in the 1930s, and it's a lot. It's confusing, and I'm just really trying to create an impression here. It was a chaotic time. It was a dangerous time, and it was a confusing time. And people had very many conflicting opinions and feelings about it. You could be appalled at what was going on in the world if you were an American. You could have great sympathy for the peoples who were being conquered in Asia and in Europe. You might look at the communist Soviet Union and the Nazi Germans going to war against each other and say, well, pox on both your houses. You might admire British grit in standing up to Hitler, but have no love for the British Empire. Particularly, you might be able to wish that somebody would stop the Italians and the Germans and the Japanese, but have no desire to spend American blood or American treasure in order to do that. And different political factions arguing left and right, and it was really hard to find anything that would simplify the question, that would help ease the confusion, the conflicting feelings, and that sort of thing. And that's why the attack on Pearl Harbor is going to be, for the American people, so important. It's going to crystallize everything. is going to end the doubt, it's going to end the argument, it's going to end the debate, it's going to sweep aside the confusion, the conflicting feelings. The flag had been fired upon, the country has been attacked, and that makes it all very, very simple. But we're not quite there yet. That's coming in our next lecture. So we're on the eve of America becoming involved in World War I, and so I want to ask you your 5 questions here. Our next lecture, we will plunge the U.S. into the war and see how the war unfolds. And there will be 5 questions that will come with that lecture. Okay, so here are your 5 questions. Your 5 questions. Name the only American president ever to be elected to a 3rd term in office. Name the only American president ever to be elected to a 3rd term in office. Okay? What is the name of the alliance that bound Germany, Italy, and Japan together? And I don't mean the tripartite pact, that's the name of the treaty, but the common name of the alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. This legislation allowed the U.S. to give the Allies aid without making them pay for it. So this legislation, this program, allows the United States to provide military aid to the Allies, England particularly, without making England pay for it. What was the name of that program? And so question number 4, what does the acronym Nazi stand for? N-A-Z-I. What is the actual name of the German political party that we know best as the Nazi Party? The Nazi Party. And then finally, what country did Nazi Germany have as an ally in the invasion and dismemberment of Poland, but then attacked and went to war against in June of 1941. So what country helped Germany invade and dismember Poland, but then was invaded by Germany in June of 1941. So those are your 5 questions. That is the end of this lecture, and when we get together next time, we will fight America's fight in World War II.